The first crack in my marriage wasn't loud. It wasn't some dramatic revelation or a screaming match. It was quiet, so quiet that I almost missed it. A lingering glance, a hurried text, a laugh that didn't quite belong. It was the kind of thing you brush off, telling yourself you're overthinking, that paranoia is just the cost of loving someone too much. Julia and I had been together for 12 years, married for 8. We had a comfortable rhythm, one built over countless shared moments, habits, and inside jokes. Life was steady, predictable, safe. Or so I thought. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes. Julia, once indifferent to her phone, began guarding it like a prized possession. She started working late more often, her explanations vague and dismissive. When I asked about her day, she responded with the kind of curated blandness that told me nothing. Suspicion crept in slowly, a whisper at the back of my mind that I refused to acknowledge. I prided myself on being a rational man, one who trusted his wife implicitly. But doubt has a way of festering, and soon, I found myself noticing inconsistencies. The smell of unfamiliar cologne on her clothes, receipts from restaurants I'd never been to, the way she suddenly cared about her appearance more than she had in years. Then came the phone call, an unknown number, a deep voice that sent chills down my spine. "You don't know me," the caller said, "but you need to know what's happening behind your back." That night, I lay in bed next to Julia, my mind racing. The weight of uncertainty was unbearable. But if this was true, if she was cheating, I needed proof. And so, I began my descent into the abyss. Over the next few weeks, I installed a tracking app on her phone, something I never thought I'd do. The guilt gnawed at me, but desperation outweighed morality. Within days, I had my answer. Her late nights at work frequently ended at a hotel on the other side of town. The reality of it hit me like a wrecking ball. Julia was having an affair. The woman I had built a life with, shared dreams with, was betraying me in the most cliché way possible. But the details were stranger than fiction. She wasn't meeting just anyone. She was meeting someone under an alias, an entirely separate identity. I dug deeper, hacking into her email, her cloud storage. What I found defied logic. There were letters, messages, even a detailed plan. Julia was leading a double life. She wasn't just having an affair. She was orchestrating an escape. A foreign bank account, a plane ticket to Lisbon, and an unsigned document that would transfer all our shared assets into her name. This wasn't infidelity. This was premeditated abandonment. I had to act. But how? I couldn't confront her outright. Not yet. First, I needed leverage. I needed to play this smart. So I began my own deception. I started keeping records, copies of emails, screenshots of her messages, bank statements, and travel plans. I needed to understand the full scope of what she was planning. She had been methodical, careful, but not careful enough. I pieced together her movements, her interactions, even her carefully curated excuses. Julia had begun spending money I couldn't trace. Luxurious dinners, boutique hotel stays, and gifts that never made their way into our home. My first assumption was that they were for her lover, but as I uncovered more details, I realized they were for herself. She was planning for a future where I did not exist. The calls from work became more frequent, her voice tinged with an excitement she never had when she spoke to me. I started listening more carefully, deciphering the unspoken words between her pauses. She wasn't just coordinating business trips. She was orchestrating an exit strategy. I followed her one night. She had told me she had a late client dinner, but my tracker led me elsewhere. A high-rise building on the other side of town, one I had never been to. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she exited her car, adjusting her dress before stepping into the lobby. A man met her at the entrance, greeting her with a familiarity that twisted my stomach into knots. They entered the elevator together, and I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. I should have felt anger, rage, betrayal, but all I felt was numbness. The truth I had been avoiding was now undeniable. My wife had been leading a double life, and I was merely a footnote in her story. I spent the next few weeks gathering evidence, pretending everything was normal. I held her, kissed her, made love to her, all while knowing the truth. It was excruciating, But I needed her to believe I was still in the dark. I needed her to slip up just once more. One evening, Julia left her laptop open, a rare mistake. Her inbox was full of emails detailing the final steps of her plan. Her secret bank account was nearly complete, her plane ticket confirmed. The final piece of the puzzle was a legal document she needed me to sign, unknowingly transferring the last of our joint assets into her control. She had planned every detail meticulously, except for me discovering it. I printed every piece of evidence, filed it away, and sat back, waiting for the perfect moment. I would not scream or fight. I would not beg or plead. No, I would let her think she had won until the very last second. And then, I would turn her world upside down. The days that followed were suffocating, each moment weighed down by the knowledge of Julia's betrayal. Life moved on around me, but I felt like I was existing outside of it, watching as my carefully constructed reality collapsed. Julia continued as if nothing had changed, kissing me in the morning, making coffee, carrying out her usual routines. But the truth lay underneath, festering like an open wound. If she believed I would remain passive, she had miscalculated. The signs had already been noticed, the evidence gathered. Now, it was time to dig deeper and expose the full extent of what she had been hiding. The first step was uncovering the financial inconsistencies. I combed through the details of our shared accounts, looking for any transactions that seemed out of place. Over the past year, small withdrawals had been made at random intervals, subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion. Individually, they appeared insignificant, but when analyzed collectively, they revealed a clear pattern. Julia had been methodically moving money into a separate account that had been hidden from me. The total amount, when calculated, reached nearly $20,000. Further investigation led me to our cloud storage, where I found a trove of hidden documents. Among them was a scanned passport under her maiden name, a plane ticket to Lisbon booked for 2 weeks from now, and a signed lease agreement for a luxury apartment overseas. This was not merely an affair. This was a plan for complete abandonment. Julia had been preparing for a future where I no longer existed in her life. The security cameras I had discreetly installed provided even more damning proof. One night, after pretending to be asleep, I reviewed the footage. Just before midnight, Julia quietly slipped out of our bedroom, taking her phone with her as she descended the stairs. She made a call, her voice hushed and careful. The conversation was brief, but her words carried an unmistakable weight. She was convinced that her plan was working, that I suspected nothing. Her tone carried a confidence that made the betrayal sting even more. Realizing the extent of her deception, I knew that waiting any longer would only allow her to tighten her grip on her scheme. A private investigator was the next logical step, so I reached out to someone highly recommended in cases like these. His name was Carter, a professional with years of experience uncovering hidden affairs and fraudulent activities. When I handed him the evidence I had gathered, the bank statements, the travel plans, the records of her movements, he assured me that every remaining detail would be uncovered. While Carter conducted his investigation, I focused my attention on Julia. Every interaction with her became an opportunity to observe, to analyze the person I had once trusted implicitly. She remained affectionate, continued her usual habits, and carried on as though nothing had changed. At times, it felt surreal to watch her so closely, knowing that each moment was built on deception. A week later, Carter delivered his findings. The truth was worse than I had anticipated. Julia's supposed lover was not just another man. He was a con artist, a career fraudster who had manipulated her into believing in a fabricated future. He had convinced her to drain our resources, move money into offshore accounts, and prepare for a new life under the illusion of love and freedom. He had promised her an escape, a life of adventure, and a clean break from the past. However, his real plan had never included Julia. Once she made the final transfer, he had no intention of meeting her in Lisbon. He had been stringing her along, waiting for the moment when he could vanish completely, leaving her stranded in a foreign country with nothing. For all her betrayal, Julia had unknowingly placed herself in a trap. She had chosen deceit, had orchestrated my erasure from her life. Yet she was the one on the brink of ruin. There was a temptation to let events unfold naturally, to allow her to step into the fate she had prepared for me. She had been so confident, so sure of her plan's success, that it seemed almost poetic to let her discover the truth in the most devastating way possible. But that wasn't enough. The betrayal, the lies, and the sheer arrogance of her actions demanded a response. Allowing her to fail on her own terms would not be sufficient. She needed to understand the gravity of what she had done, to feel the consequences as sharply as I had felt them. With this realization, a plan began to take shape. Julia believed she was in control, but the pieces were now moving against her. The same deception she had wielded so effortlessly would now be turned against her. Carter's expertise would ensure that every step was executed flawlessly. The goal was not just to expose her, but to dismantle everything she had built in secrecy. The strategy was simple. Set a trap, allow Julia to walk into it, and ensure that she understood the full weight of her choices before it was too late. She had underestimated me, believing that I would remain blind to the truth. That, above all, had been her greatest mistake. The more I learned about Julia's plan, the more the pieces fell into place, forming a picture that no longer shocked me, but only deepened my resolve. The betrayal was more than a simple affair. It was a carefully constructed strategy to remove me from her life entirely. Yet, in the cruelest twist of fate, she had unknowingly placed herself in the hands of a predator, one who would discard her the moment she had nothing left to give. This knowledge fueled my patience. I could have confronted her with the evidence right away, shattered the illusion she believed herself to be orchestrating. But that would have been too easy. She needed to experience the depth of what she had done, needed to feel the same weight of deception crushing her that she had intended for me. That would be justice, not merely revenge. I worked carefully, methodically, ensuring every move I made was measured. My private investigator, Carter, continued feeding me details as he uncovered them. Julia's mysterious lover, her supposed escape plan, had a long history of fraud and manipulation. He had done this before, lured women in with grand promises only to leave them destitute. She wasn't his first mark, and she wouldn't be his last. The thought might have made me pity her had she not chosen this path willingly, blind to the reality of the game she was playing. To ensure that my plan was executed perfectly, I started shifting our finances. The joint accounts Julia had been subtly withdrawing from were quietly reinforced with protections she wouldn't see coming. Any further attempts to access funds would be blocked, requiring my explicit approval. I liquidated certain assets, moved investments into new accounts under my sole control, and ensured that by the time she realized it, she would be powerless to recover anything. I also worked on creating an illusion for her to cling to. If she suspected that I had even an inkling of her deception, she might act prematurely, throwing away her plans before I could let them unravel completely. So, I became more affectionate, more attentive. Exactly what she would expect from a trusting husband who had no idea his wife was preparing to leave him. It sickened me to play the role, but it was necessary. I smiled when she smiled, laughed when she laughed, and pretended not to notice when she sent furtive messages late at night. With every false gesture, she fell deeper into her own web. She believed she had outmaneuvered me, that I was nothing more than a pawn in her grand scheme. That belief would be her undoing. As the day of her supposed departure approached, I made the final preparations. A close friend who worked in airport security arranged to have me alerted when Julia checked in for her flight. I would know the exact moment she thought she had finally escaped. I also ensured that the fraudulent transactions she had conducted with her lover would be flagged, tying her financial misdeeds to him in a way that would unravel everything she had built. The evening before her flight, I watched her pack. She moved through the bedroom with an almost giddy energy, placing expensive dresses and carefully folded documents into her suitcase. Each item she packed felt like another nail in the coffin of the life we had once shared. But I didn't react. I let her believe that nothing was amiss, that I remained blissfully ignorant. By the time she left the next morning, the trap had already been set. I watched from the upstairs window as she climbed into a cab, checked her phone one last time, and disappeared down the street. It was strange, feeling no sadness at the sight of her leaving. The woman I had married was gone long before that moment. What remained was nothing more than a stranger. My phone buzzed shortly after. It was my contact at the airport, confirming that Julia had checked in and passed security. That was my cue. I sent the final instructions to Carter, ensuring that Julia's fraudulent activity was exposed. Her attempt to move the last of our joint funds into her offshore account was blocked, and the fraud alert placed on the transactions would ensure that authorities took immediate notice. Her lover's history of financial crimes meant that he, too, would be implicated, leaving them both to face the consequences of their actions. The moment Julia landed in Lisbon, she would realize her fate. She would step off the plane, expecting to be greeted by the man who had promised her everything, only to find nothing waiting for her. Her bank account would be frozen, her carefully laid plans dismantled, and she would be left stranded with no money, no contacts, and no way home. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Not because of what I had done, but because I had taken back control. Julia had sought to erase me from her life, but in the end, she had only erased herself. Now all that remained was the fallout. By the time Julia landed in Lisbon, her carefully constructed world had already crumbled. She stepped off the plane expecting a future filled with promises and freedom, but instead, she was met with silence. No welcoming arms, no familiar face waiting for her. Just the cold realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Her phone calls went unanswered, her texts unread, and every second that passed tightened the noose around her illusions. Meanwhile, I sat back and watched as the pieces continued to fall into place. The moment Julia had left our home, my final steps in dismantling her plans had already been set into motion. The fraud alerts placed on her transactions had not only locked her out of our joint accounts but had flagged her offshore transfers as suspicious activity. Before she even landed, her financial assets had been frozen, ensuring that she had no access to the money she had so desperately tried to steal. I imagined the panic setting in as she frantically tried to withdraw money, only to realize that her bank accounts were empty, her credit cards declined. She had nothing. Not even the comfort of the man she had sacrificed everything for. Because as it turned out, her so-called lover had vanished the moment he realized she was no longer of use to him. His phone number was disconnected, his email accounts deleted. He had been playing her from the start, using her greed and desperation to his advantage. And now, he had taken what little remained and disappeared into the shadows. For Julia, the nightmare had only begun. Stranded in a foreign country with no money, no contacts, and no way home, she had only one option left me. It didn't take long before I received the first message. A single, desperate plea for help. I let her message sit unread for hours. The woman who had spent months plotting my erasure, who had tried to replace me without a second thought, was now asking for my mercy. A bitter sense of satisfaction settled in my chest. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Julia had orchestrated this collapse, believing herself invincible, and now she needed to feel the full weight of the consequences. Over the next few days, her messages became more frequent. At first, they were laced with half-hearted justifications, pathetic attempts to rationalize her betrayal. She had felt trapped, she claimed. She had wanted something more. She hadn't meant for it to end this way. But as reality continued to crush her under its weight, the tone shifted from anger to pleading. She needed money to get back home. She needed a place to stay. She needed me to understand that she had made a mistake, that things had gone too far, that we could fix this. But there was no we anymore. There hadn't been for a long time. Instead of responding, I let her spiral further into desperation. Each ignored message, each unreturned call, chipped away at whatever delusion she had left. I could only imagine her pacing in a dingy hostel, eyes darting between the door and the phone, waiting for a miracle that would never come. She had spent so much time crafting her escape that she had never once considered what failure would look like. And yet, despite everything, I found myself standing at a crossroads. I had every reason to abandon her completely, to leave her stranded as she had intended to do to me. And yet, a small part of me hesitated. Not out of love. I had long since buried whatever affection I had left for Julia, but out of a need for finality. The story wasn't finished until I was the one who chose the ending. So, I sent a single message. Plane ticket. One way. Economy class. Returning her to a city where she no longer had a home, no longer had a future. It was not an act of kindness. It was an execution of judgment. She responded immediately, thanking me, promising that she would explain everything when she returned. But I had no intention of ever seeing her again. The moment her plane touched down, she would find the locks changed, her belongings packed and sent to a storage unit she would have to pay for herself. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no final words exchanged. She had already said everything that mattered when she chose to betray me. As she boarded her flight, I closed the last chapter of our story. Not with rage, not with bitterness, but with the quiet certainty that she had destroyed herself far more thoroughly than I ever could have. Julia's return to the city did not mark the beginning of redemption. There were no heartfelt apologies that could rewrite the past, no tearful reunions where wounds miraculously healed. The reality of what she had done remained unchangeable, and so did the consequences. When she arrived, the home she once shared with me was no longer hers. The locks had been changed, her belongings had been shipped off to a storage unit under her name, and every trace of her existence had been wiped from my life. I had expected her to lash out, to demand an explanation, to fight back in the same calculating way she had built her deception. But when she realized that she had nothing left to cling to, she did not rage. Instead, she crumbled. The messages started again, less frequent now, each one a reflection of her steady unraveling. She had no money, no place to go, no one left to turn to. She begged for another chance, but there was no sympathy left in me to give. As Julia struggled to find stability, I found myself rediscovering something I had thought was lost: peace. The weight that had pressed down on my chest for months had lifted, replaced by a clarity I had never known. For so long, I had been trapped in a web of lies and betrayal, suffocating under the realization that the woman I had loved was nothing more than a stranger. Now, she was gone, and with her, the last remnants of the life I had mistakenly believed was unshakable. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet victories. I finalized the divorce with an efficiency that left no room for dispute. With the legal documents filed, Julia had no claim to anything beyond what little she had left. Every joint account had been severed, every financial tie cut. I had prepared for every possible attempt she might make to reclaim something from me. But in the end, she barely had the strength to fight. Occasionally, I heard whispers of where she had ended up. A friend of a friend mentioned seeing her working at a cafe, barely getting by. Another time, someone mentioned she had moved into a cheap rental on the outskirts of town, far from the circles she once navigated with such confidence. I never sought her out, never asked for details. The woman she had become was no longer my concern. In time, the messages stopped altogether. No more desperate pleas, no more attempts to justify what could never be justified. The silence was the final confirmation that our story had reached its inevitable conclusion. She had finally accepted what I had known from the moment I uncovered her betrayal. There was no coming back from this. Looking back, I didn't feel triumphant. This was not a victory in the traditional sense, but rather a reclamation of the life that had been stolen from me. Julia had built a future on lies, and when those lies collapsed, she was left with nothing. That was not my doing, it was hers. In the quiet solitude of my new life, I began to piece myself together again. I redecorated the house, erasing the remnants of a life shared with someone who no longer existed in my world. I changed my routine, focused on my career, and reconnected with friends who had watched from the sidelines, unable to intervene in the storm that had consumed me. One evening, as I walked through the city, I passed by the cafe where Julia had been seen working. Through the glass window, I caught a glimpse of her. She looked different, thinner, her face etched with a weariness that had not been there before. She was wiping down a table, her movements slow and deliberate, her shoulders slumped forward. She didn't see me, and I made no effort to make my presence known. There was nothing left to say. For a fleeting moment, I felt something close to pity, but it passed as quickly as it came. She had made her choices, and she was living with them now. Perhaps, in time, she would find her own peace, just as I had found mine. The echoes of her betrayal would never fully disappear, but they no longer defined me. I had faced the worst of it, had walked through the fire, and emerged on the other side. Stronger, wiser, free. Months passed, and the scars left behind by Julia's deception began to fade. I traveled, something I had always wanted to do but had never prioritized. I picked up old hobbies, reigniting passions that had been buried beneath the weight of my broken marriage. And, eventually, I opened my heart again. The fear of being hurt still lingered in the background, a whisper in the quiet moments, but it no longer dictated my actions. I knew now that betrayal did not define me, nor did it hold the power to destroy me. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape. With that realization, I stepped forward into the next chapter of my life. And for the first time in a long time, it was mine to write.